Power is one of the most fascinating forces in human society. It shapes nations, defines careers, and fundamentally alters how people see themselves and the world around them. But here's what's interesting. Power doesn't just come from external circumstances. It's deeply rooted in psychology. The way we gain power, maintain it, use it, and sometimes lose it all comes down to how our minds work. Today, we're going to explore this through the lens of one of the most psychologically studied public figures in modern history, Donald Trump. Now, before anyone gets defensive, let me be clear. This isn't a political endorsement or attack. This is a psychological examination. And honestly, whether you love him or hate him, his case is absolutely fascinating from a psychological standpoint. He's like a masterclass in how personality, power, and perception interact. So let's start with the basics. When psychologists talk about power, they're referring to a person's ability to influence others and control resources. It's not inherently good or bad, it's just a social reality. But here's where it gets interesting. When someone has power, it actually changes their brain chemistry. Studies show that power increases dopamine levels, which makes people more confident, more willing to take risks, and sometimes less empathetic. It's like an invisible drug coursing through your system. Trump is a fascinating case study because his entire trajectory has been about accumulating and leveraging power. He didn't grow up in poverty working toward the American dream. He was born into wealth and privilege. His father, Fred Trump, was already a successful real estate developer. So from the beginning, Donald Trump had access to power. But here's what's crucial. Having access to power and knowing how to use it are two different things. Trump took what his father built and expanded it dramatically. He learned early that confidence could be a tool. Not just regular confidence, but what psychologists call narcissistic confidence, an unwavering belief in your own superiority. Now let's talk about narcissism, because you're going to hear this word a lot when discussing Trump, and it deserves real explanation, not just dismissal. Narcissism isn't just vanity. Clinical narcissism exists on a spectrum. At one end, you have people with narcissistic personality disorder, a genuine psychological condition. At the other end, you have people with narcissistic traits. These traits include an excessive need for admiration, a lack of empathy, a sense of entitlement, and an exaggerated view of one's own importance. Trump exhibits many of these traits. He's famously referenced himself in interviews more than any president in history. He's praised his own properties, his deals, his intelligence, his appearance. He's used superlatives constantly: the best, tremendous, incredible. Is this a psychological disorder? That's something only a licensed clinician who'd evaluated him could determine. But are these narcissistic traits visible? Absolutely. Here's what's important to understand about narcissism and power. They have a complicated relationship. Narcissistic traits can actually be advantageous in certain contexts. If you're trying to sell real estate, confidence in your product matters. If you're trying to convince people to follow you, self-belief is persuasive. Narcissistic individuals often take more risks, which can lead to bigger wins and bigger losses. Trump's entire business career is a case study in this. Massive successes like his development of Trump Tower, alongside significant failures like his Atlantic City casinos. The thing about narcissism is that it protects the ego. If you believe you're the best, failures don't actually hurt as much because you can reframe them. Trump declared bankruptcy multiple times, yet he never seemed diminished by it. He just moved on to the next project. A person with a fragile ego might be devastated. A person with narcissistic traits views it differently. It's not failure. It's a temporary setback caused by external factors. Now let's talk about another psychological element that's crucial to understanding Trump: his relationship with the media. Trump has always had an obsession with media coverage, which is fascinating from a psychological perspective. In psychology, we talk about the concept of mirroring, the idea that our sense of self is partly reflected back to us by how others perceive us. For most of us, this has a moderating effect. We get feedback, we adjust. But Trump's use of media has been different. He doesn't just respond to coverage, he actively creates it. Think about his catchphrases, his feuds with journalists, his Twitter activity. These aren't random. They're strategic methods of controlling the narrative. If he's in the news, even negative news, he's still relevant, still powerful, still being talked about. Psychologically, this is called narcissistic supply, the attention and admiration that narcissistic individuals crave. Trump's relationship with controversy can be understood partly through this lens. Controversy is attention. Attention is supply. This connects to another fascinating psychological concept, the locus of control. This is essentially whether you believe your life is controlled by your own actions or by external factors. People with an internal locus of control believe they're the authors of their destiny. People with an external locus of control believe circumstances determine their fate. Trump has consistently demonstrated an internal locus of control. Even when things go wrong, it's rarely because of him. It's bad deals, bad timing, bad judges, bad media. The world is responding to him, not the other way around. Here's something really interesting about power and psychology. It actually changes how your brain processes information. When you have power, studies show you become less likely to take other people's perspectives. You're more likely to stereotype. You interrupt more. You're less likely to attend to what others are saying. This is called the power reduces perspective-taking effect. And you can see this play out in Trump's communication style. His speeches are rarely about what others think or need. They're about what he thinks, what he's done, what he will do. Now let's talk about his business empire and what it reveals about his psychological makeup. Trump built a brand as much as he built real estate. In fact, you could argue the brand became more valuable than the actual properties. Trump Tower, Trump Steaks, Trump Water, Trump University. He put his name on everything. This isn't random. It's a psychological strategy. By making Trump synonymous with quality and success, he created a personal mythology. And here's the thing, mythology is powerful. If enough people believe something, it becomes functionally true, regardless of the underlying reality. This ties into what psychologists call self-presentation or impression management. We all do this to some degree. We curate what we share, we emphasize certain aspects of ourselves, but Trump has taken it to an art form. The carefully maintained image of success, the superlatives, the association with luxury, these are all carefully constructed presentations. Are they aligned with reality? That's complex. He has had genuine successes. He's also had genuine failures. But the presentation is always of success. What's fascinating is that this kind of sustained self-presentation requires a certain level of psychological consistency. You have to genuinely believe the narrative you're selling, or it falls apart. And here's where it gets really interesting. There's psychological research suggesting that when you repeatedly tell yourself a story about who you are, you start to believe it more deeply. Trump's constant self-promotion might not just be about convincing others. It might be about convincing himself. Let's talk about his relationship with loyalty and betrayal. Trump frequently surrounds himself with people, builds them up, then turns on them publicly when they disappoint him. Gary Cohn, Jeff Sessions, Michael Flynn, Rex Tillerson. The list is long. From a psychological perspective, this pattern suggests something important about how Trump relates to others. People aren't really individuals to him. They're either allies who serve his interests or enemies who have betrayed him. This is consistent with what psychologists call splitting, the tendency to see things in black and white, good versus bad, without much middle ground. This relates directly to empathy, which is a crucial component of human psychology that influences how we treat others. Research on narcissism consistently shows that narcissistic individuals have reduced capacity for empathy, particularly cognitive empathy, the ability to understand another person's perspective. Whether Trump has genuine empathy difficulties or simply acts as though he does is something we can't determine without clinical assessment. But the behavioral patterns suggest limited consideration for others' feelings or viewpoints. Now here's something important. We need to distinguish between Trump as a psychological specimen and Trump as a political figure. His psychological traits may have been assets in business. They may have been assets in capturing the presidency. But do those same traits serve him well in governance? That's a different question entirely. Governance requires compromise, perspective-taking, consideration of complex information, and willingness to adjust course based on feedback. These aren't traits that Trump's psychology naturally gravitates toward. Let's discuss his relationship with truth and reality. Trump has demonstrated what researchers call strategic ambiguity, the ability to make statements that are technically true but deeply misleading. He also frequently makes demonstrably false statements and seems unconcerned when they're debunked. There are a few psychological explanations for this. First, narcissistic individuals often have an enhanced ability to rationalize contradictions. Second, he may operate from a worldview where truth is whatever benefits his interests in the moment. Third, there's something called motivated reasoning. We all do this to some degree, but it's particularly pronounced in certain personality types, where we unconsciously process information in ways that support what we already believe. This brings us to the concept of cognitive biases and how they influence perception of Trump himself. People who support Trump tend to interpret ambiguous information as supporting him. People who oppose him do the same but in the opposite direction. This is called confirmation bias, and it's universal. But it's worth noting because it means our understanding of Trump is filtered through our existing beliefs. That's a psychological fact worth acknowledging. Let's talk about his communication style, because it's genuinely psychologically distinctive. Trump uses short sentences, simple vocabulary, repetition, and superlatives. He tells stories more than he presents arguments. His sentences often don't have complete thoughts. There's a conversational quality that feels authentic to many people, even if the content is sometimes inaccurate. From a persuasion psychology perspective, this is actually quite effective. Simple, concrete language is more persuasive than complex language. Repetition increases belief through something called the illusory truth effect. Storytelling engages the brain differently than facts and figures do. There's also something called charisma, which is relevant here. Charisma isn't just attractiveness or charm. It's a psychological phenomenon where certain individuals can create intense emotional connections with others. Trump has this quality for his supporters. He speaks with absolute certainty. He presents himself as powerful and in control. He identifies enemies and allies clearly. For people who are anxious about social change or uncertain about the future, this kind of clarity and confidence can be incredibly appealing, regardless of whether the actual information is accurate. Now let's examine his relationship with risk and decision-making. Trump has demonstrated a pattern of making high-stakes decisions quickly, often with incomplete information. In business, this sometimes worked brilliantly. Sometimes it resulted in major losses. The psychology here is interesting. Trump seems to have what's called a high sensation-seeking personality, a tendency to seek out novelty, risk, and excitement. High sensation seekers are often entrepreneurial, creative, and willing to take chances. But they can also be impulsive and struggle with delayed gratification. His approach to the presidency reflected this same psychology. He preferred unilateral action to deliberation. He preferred disruption to stability. He was willing to pursue policies that traditional politicians would consider too risky. For his supporters, this reflected strength and change. For critics, it reflected recklessness. But from a purely psychological perspective, it's consistent with his personality profile. Let's talk about his relationship with criticism. One of the most distinctive aspects of Trump's psychology is his extremely negative response to criticism. He rarely admits error. He never apologizes. Instead, he attacks the critic, delegitimizes them, calls them names. This might seem like simple stubbornness, but psychologically, it suggests something specific. A very fragile ego that requires constant protection through aggressive defense. This is actually inconsistent with true self-confidence. Someone who is genuinely secure doesn't need to attack everyone who disagrees with them. They can sit with criticism, consider it, respond thoughtfully. Trump's pattern of attacking critics suggests that criticism feels like a genuine threat to his sense of self. This is consistent with vulnerable narcissism, where the outward confidence masks deep insecurity. Here's something crucial to understand. Many of the most powerful people in history have had similar psychological profiles. Napoleon had narcissistic traits. Andrew Jackson had them. JFK had them. So did many successful CEOs and entrepreneurs. The question isn't whether having these traits automatically makes someone good or bad at their job. It's how those traits interact with the specific demands of their role. As a businessman in a competitive market where confidence and risk-taking are valued, Trump's traits were generally advantageous. As a president, where the job requires different skills, compromise, perspective-taking, nuance, acceptance of limits on power, those same traits created different outcomes. Let's talk about his relationship with his family. Trump has spoken extensively about his children, particularly his sons and his daughter Ivanka. He's been proud of their accomplishments and involved them in his business and political life. Psychologically, this is interesting because it suggests that Trump's capacity for connection and care isn't non-existent. His children clearly matter to him. This complicates simple diagnoses. People with genuine empathy deficits often struggle to connect even with family members. Trump's clear investment in his children suggests his empathy deficits, if they exist, may be selective rather than universal. There's also the question of generational psychology. Trump's parents' generation, and his father specifically, influenced his worldview. His father was a successful but relatively quiet businessman. Donald took his father's model and amplified it dramatically. This is common in psychology. Children often take their parents' traits and push them further. The question of whether Trump would have become who he is without his father's foundation is unanswerable, but the influence is undeniable. Now let's discuss power and accountability. One of the most challenging aspects of Trump's psychology is his apparent inability to experience genuine accountability. Psychologically, this likely stems from a combination of factors. First, his power. Genuine power insulates you from normal consequences. You can say things other people would be fired for. You can make decisions that would ruin others. Second, his psychological profile. Narcissism combined with high sensation-seeking creates a personality that struggles to internalize blame. Third, his environment. People around him, particularly devoted followers, often enable this by refusing to hold him accountable. There's a concept in psychology called the fundamental attribution error, the tendency to blame people's behavior on their personality rather than their circumstances. When it comes to Trump, both his supporters and his critics fall into this trap. Supporters attribute his behaviors to his confidence and strength. Critics attribute them to his narcissism and corruption. But the truth is, behavior is always an interaction between personality and situation. Put Trump in a different role with different constraints, and his behavior might look different. But that's a thought experiment we can't test. Let's examine his use of language and specifically his creation of what might be called Trump terminology. Terms like fake news, witch hunt, tremendous, believe me, these have become his linguistic signature. From a psychological perspective, this serves multiple purposes. It creates an in-group for his supporters who understand and use his language. It simplifies complex issues into catchphrases. It creates a sense of shared identity and understanding. There's also something called linguistic power. The ability to define terms, to frame issues, to name things is a form of power itself. By constantly repeating certain phrases, by asserting definitions of reality, Trump is engaging in linguistic power. And it works. That's what psychologists studying persuasion have found. When someone with authority and confidence repeatedly asserts something, people tend to internalize it, regardless of its accuracy. Now, let's talk about something that's often overlooked in psychological discussions of Trump, his age and how aging might interact with his personality. Trump is now in his late 70s and 80s. Neuroscience shows that the brain changes with age, and certain traits can intensify. Narcissistic traits can actually become more pronounced with age, particularly if someone hasn't experienced significant consequences that might have challenged those traits earlier. Cognitive flexibility, the ability to change your mind, to adjust your thinking, often decreases with age. This might explain some of his behavioral patterns. There's also the question of his physical health and how that might influence his psychology. We know he's had COVID-19. We know he's a heavy user of stimulants, if various reports are accurate. Sleep deprivation, physical illness, and certain medications can all influence personality expression and decision-making. So his current psychology is likely influenced by factors beyond his baseline personality. Let's talk about the psychology of his supporters. Understanding Trump requires understanding why millions of people are drawn to him. From a psychological perspective, there are several factors. First, many of his supporters experienced real economic anxiety. Trump offered simple explanations for complex problems. That's psychologically appealing. Second, cultural change was happening rapidly. Trump represented a kind of resistance to that change. For people feeling left behind, that was reassuring. Third, his opponents were often portrayed as elites who looked down on ordinary people. Trump positioned himself as fighting for ordinary people against elites. There's also something called terror management theory, the psychological principle that when people feel threatened or anxious about mortality and meaning, they're drawn to authority figures who seem strong and confident. A charismatic leader who offers clear answers and strong leadership can be deeply appealing in times of uncertainty. Now let's consider the psychology of his opposition. People who oppose Trump often do so with equal intensity. Why? Similar principles apply. Trump represents a threat to their worldview, their values, their sense of what America should be. Opposition becomes its own form of identity and motivation. This is worth noting because it means the psychological forces pulling people toward and away from Trump are often equally powerful and often equally irrational. Here's something that's not often discussed. Trump might actually be more psychologically self-aware than his critics give him credit for. He clearly understands how to use media. He clearly understands what motivates people. He clearly understands how to create a narrative. Whether this constitutes genuine self-awareness or is more intuitive and automatic is unclear. But he's not operating randomly. His chaos has a method. Let's talk about his relationship with legacy. Most of our lives are forgotten quickly. Most of us will fade from memory. But people with narcissistic traits often have an intense concern with legacy, with being remembered with their place in history. Trump has been obsessed with this. It's part of why he's been so litigious, so concerned with his image, so interested in how he's portrayed. He wants to matter historically. That's a human desire, but it's particularly intense in people with narcissistic traits. There's also the question of redemption and whether Trump is capable of it. Psychological redemption requires admitting fault, accepting consequences, changing behavior. Trump's psychological makeup makes this almost impossible, which means if Trump ever falls from power, truly falls, the psychological process of dealing with that would be extraordinarily difficult. How would a narcissistic personality cope with genuine, undeniable loss of power? That's an open question. Let's consider the psychology of conspiracy thinking, because Trump has frequently engaged with conspiracy theories. From a psychological perspective, conspiracy thinking serves functions. It provides explanation and control. A chaotic world is frightening. A world where powerful people are orchestrating events feels more controllable than one that's genuinely random. It provides community. People who believe conspiracies feel like they're part of an enlightened group that sees reality others don't. It fits with certain personality traits. People high in narcissism are actually more susceptible to conspiracy thinking because it confirms their worldview that the world revolves around important battles between good and evil. Now, here's something important to consider in conclusions. Psychological profiles are descriptive, not prescriptive. Understanding Trump's psychology doesn't mean he's good or bad, right or wrong. It means understanding the underlying patterns that drive his behavior. It means being less surprised by what he does and more able to predict it. Power, ultimately, is a psychological reality as much as a social one. It changes how we think, how we behave, how we see others. Trump is a fascinating study in power, how it's gained, how it's used, how it shapes a person. Whether you see him as a visionary or a threat, understanding the psychology behind his actions gives you better tools for making sense of him and our world. The psychology of power isn't just about understanding Trump. It's about understanding how power works in human beings generally. We all have narcissistic traits to some degree. We all resist criticism. We all rationalize our failures. We all seek admiration. Trump is different in degree, not necessarily in kind. He's an amplified version of patterns that exist in all of us, which is partly why he's so psychologically fascinating. His case teaches us about the interaction between personality and circumstances, between individual psychology and social influence, between who we are and what we become when given power. And that's a lesson that extends far beyond one person.